Welcome everyone to the Google Drive question time about the SDK. Sorry we're a bit late, we had some minor technical difficulties, but we're here now. My name's Ali.
I'm Claudio.
And we're going to be looking at the questions that you've been asking on Stack Overflow, see if we can come up with some answers for you. So the first question we have is, why is the redirect URL in Google Drive modified when an app is called from the Google Drive UI? So there's a bit of information about that, but if possible, Claudia, you could describe what a redirect URL is or what the auth flow is. That would be fantastic.
Sure, I'll start from that, but then spoilers first. I don't think the redirect URL is modified by the Google app, but let's go back to what redirect URL is. So in order for your application to be authorized to access the user's files, the application has to go through the so-called auth flow. You've probably seen it many times when you install an application on your phone, let's say, and you'll see that the application wants to access your files. So you have to grant access to it or deny access to it. And of course, if you deny access, the application will not work. That page is provided by the auth flow. So when you build your application and you want to use this kind of authorization mechanism, you define some parameters in the Google API console. And one of them is the redirect URL. How this works is like this. The application needs to be authorized to access some files. So it will send a request to Google. Google will show you a page that says what the application wants, in this case, access to files or documents, and it can be read-only, write-only. There are different scopes you can request access to. And then the user clicks on Grant Access. When that happens, Google takes the user back to the page that is listed in the redirect URL in the API console. So we don't do any change to that URL. We just take it as it is from the API console, which you configure, and we send you back. What you should do, what you should make sure though, is that this redirect URL that is defined in the API console matches the one that you define in your application code. If they don't match, the auth flow will fail with an error that is called redirect URI mismatch. And I think this is exactly what is happening here in this question. The user has defined, the developer has defined a redirect URL that is something like site.com/app, while the API console says that the redirect URL is site.com without /app. So there is a mismatch, and for security reason, we cannot approve this access and the flow fails.
So the OAuth 2.0 specification is very clear about this. You have to check at each stage that the redirect URL matches. So that's just what we're doing here. And as Claudia rightly says, it's likely that they're not the same. Now, I have 3 tips I always do, because this is an error that we get quite a lot when we're writing our own personal applications. So I do 3 things. Well, the first one, I check that I haven't made a typo. Okay. The second one is to make sure that the protocol is right. So if it's an HTTP redirect, that's exactly what it is. It's not an HTTPS redirect. So check that. And the third one is to check trailing slashes. So if there's a trailing slash on the end of the URL, that's not the same as one without. So I usually check those 3 things, and that covers most minor mistakes that you can make.
Just to make it super clear, it has to be exactly the same. It doesn't matter if they start with the same URL or they're in the same domain or anything else. They have to be the same.
Yeah. And if you want more information on that, please check out the OAuth 2.0 spec.
There's also another thing we can add, is that when you define your application in the API's console, you can also specify more than one redirect URL. And so you in the API's console, you define them 1 per line, and each of them would be valid. Of course, you have to have the same URLs in your application. But if you need more, let's say you need more for, you need 1 for testing that is internal only, and 1 for the public application, the real application that external users will use. Then you can define both and try, and that will work the same way.
Absolutely. And also localhost and this kind of thing is absolutely fine. So as long as they match, you're onto a winner. So that's, I think, the answer to that question.
Do we have other questions?
We have other questions. Another one about OAuth, since we're warm on the topic.
Okay.
So I'm having clarification on OAuth flow in Python Google Drive sample application Dr. Edit. Dr. Edit is a application that we wrote in a few different languages, and it's a full end-to-end sample that you can use to get yourself going with a Drive app. Now, when the application is called from the Google Drive UI, the application checks that it is authorized to make requests to Google Drive. In the event that access has been revoked, it tries to reauthorize using the following code. And how does it do that? It redirects back to the authorization endpoint so that the user can authorize. My problem is that when I revoke access of the application from my Google dashboard and try and open it via Google Drive UI, it redirects me to the authorization page, then redirects back to the application after I authorize it, but it manages to retain the state. I think this is inconsistent with what the code describes, and I was wondering if there is any explanation for this behavior.
I think that's actually by design. So let's explain this. The first time the user opens your application, the user has to go through the auth flow and manually grant access to the application. When that happens, Google returns two different tokens, a long-lived refresh token and a short-lived access token. The access token is what you need to send requests, and it only lives for about 1 hour though. So whenever that expires, you have to use the refresh token to request a new access token and then use the application as nothing happened. The problem or the design is that you only get the refresh token the first time the user grants access to your app, and then you have to store it, for instance, in your database. And this is what Dr. Edit, the app we have, does. It stores the refresh token in the database. In case the database is corrupt, in case you lose access to the database, or in case the user revokes access to the application, that refresh token is no longer valid. So if the user wants to go back to the app and use it again, we have to send the user back to the grant access page. This is not automatic, but this is covered by the application, so it's described in the documentation we have. So whenever we realize we have no refresh token, we have to send the user back to the grant access page. And in order to do that, we have to build an authorization URL with some specific parameters. After that, the user grants access and everything goes back to the normal flow. One thing we added to this normal behavior is that we save the state. The state stores some information about what the user is doing. For instance, if the user is opening a new file or creating opening an existing file or creating a new file, we pass that in the state parameter. So we want to keep that, because otherwise, if we don't, then we have less than optimal user experience. When the user let's say the user is editing a file, and he spends a long time writing a document, he writes this novel on Dr. Edit, and the access token expires, and we need to refresh it from a refresh token, but for some reason we cannot get access to that refresh token. We have to send the user back to the grant access page, but we don't want the user to lose what he was doing.
Exactly.
So if he was editing an existing file, we want the user then to go back to the same page. So we send it back to the access page, grant access page, but we also want the user to go back to the page it was working on before. That's why we store the state parameter.
Exactly. And again, the state parameter is something that is in the OAuth 2.0 spec, and is very useful for this purpose, for an application when the user authorizes to know what the user was doing before they were sent away to authorize. In the Drive applications situation, we actually use that very specifically to say what it's using. But in other situations, you can use the state for whatever you like.
Yeah, and then the Drive application, when the application is integrated with the Drive UI, we send some specific parameters which are listed in our documentation. Probably the most important is the action we pass to the user, so that when a user tries to open an existing file from the Drive UI, we pass some parameters in the state. There are the action, which is open, and the unique identifier of the file the user is trying to open, so that then the application knows what user wants to do and which file the user is trying to access. Same thing for when we create a file. We say that the action is create, and we also say where the user is trying to create, the folder the user is trying to create the file in.
And if you're interested in how that exactly looks or how to parse that, again, look at our Dr. Edit samples in your chosen language, and there's an example for each of them on how to parse it.
Which are the languages we support?
So currently for Dr. Edit, we have Python, we have Java, we have .NET, we have PHP, and we have Ruby.
Okay. What about Go? I think you wrote one.
So we do have half a sample for Go.
Okay.
We'll look to get that out. We do have specific samples for API calling in Go. So if Go's your thing, firstly, nice one. Secondly, check out our samples that are in our reference documentation. I know there's at least one person using them externally, so that's great. I personally love Go.
Cool.
Right, next question. How to integrate Google Docs with PHP? This seems to be a question we get asked a lot.
Yeah, and it's a bit broad question.
It's a broad question. Please help me. Always a good start. Integrating Google Docs for PHP. I want to use Google Docs as a database for my application in PHP. I want to upload and download files for Google Docs irrespective of using PHP. So I guess that means, how do I access Google Docs with PHP? Well, nowadays, before I let Claudia answer this question, nowadays Google Docs is Google Drive. So we would very much recommend using the Drive API. And Claudia is going to tell you a bit about that.
Well, as you said before, we have complete samples in many different languages, and PHP is one of them. Right. So the Google Drive API completely supports PHP, and we have samples for each operation, including file upload and download, which is probably the main use case, but it's also what this guy is looking for. And we also have a complete application, Dreadit, and we strongly recommend people to use the new Drive API, which has a totally new backend and a new set of libraries, a new set of samples. The existing Documents List API is still supported. It also has support for PHP, but the resources that can be accessed by the Documents List API and the Drive API are exactly the same resources. So at the moment, right now, there is no real advantage in using the old Documents List API, because all of its features are now supported by the Drive API v2, which we released a couple of weeks ago at Google I/O. So
unless you love XML, for example, or unless your application is already heavily integrated with the Documents List API, we certainly wouldn't use it for any new code. Would you agree with that, Claudia?
I would agree. I mean, if you have existing code and it can be a problem to port that to the new library and the new infrastructure, then of course you can keep using the Documents List API. But for new development, we strongly recommend using the Drive API. It's also more efficient. It's easier to understand, and just JSON instead of XML, and many other advantages. And of course, we must say that we now focus more on its development than the old version of the API.
Right, absolutely right. Certainly with new features and that kind of thing, that's where we're focused at the moment. Uploading a local file to Google Drive. I'm looking at code taken from the official documentation shown below to upload a file from the local hard drive to Google Drive. Does anyone know what the form that I would use to post the necessary JSON and media would look like? I've looked high and low for an example, but I cannot find one. I can tell you from the code sample that he's using Python, and the sample is exactly copied from the documentation.
Okay.
So
it would be useful. So this is a general answer. Anytime you report something on Stack Overflow, thank you for that. But also try to be as specific as possible. And if something fails, there's usually an error message that says a lot about what went wrong. So with that, we can easily help you. This user is asking for this exact JSON format to upload a file. So in our code snippets, we have code snippets for each language, including Python, which is what this guy is using. But we also have a specific page for the upload protocol that describes the JSON that you have to send and all the parameters you can use. So we have complete samples in all the supported languages, but we also have a page that describes the protocol. We have actually different ways to upload files to Google Drive, and maybe you want to talk about them?
Yeah, I think kind of more interesting here is exactly why this sample is failing. We did speak about the different upload types in one of our previous, so I don't want to bore these guys. But how the Dreadit sample works is because it's a web application, it doesn't, and running on App Engine, there's no concept of files, local files. So this uses an upload type called the media in-memory upload that essentially takes a string and a MIME type and imagines it's a file. What you would do on a local file is use a media file upload that takes a file name on the local disk. You can optionally pass it a MIME type, or it can do the discovery of work out what the MIME type is for you. So I think what would solve this person's problem is to actually just replace the media in-memory upload with a media file upload, and instead of passing the data as a string, just to pass the file name and allow the API library to do that.
Assuming that the user is not using App Engine.
Yeah, well, it says, I mean, very good assumption, but it says here a local file, so I'm assuming that...
Yes, if you're using App Engine, can you read a local file on your computer?
No, the App Engine has no local file.
Exactly.
So not only on your system, on the server itself, there's no concept of
Yeah, in that case, I think maybe you have to upload a file with something like a HTML upload to your application and then send it back to Google, but it's kind of messy, and it's probably not what this guy is trying to do.
So yeah, so I'm fairly sure he's writing an application that communicates directly from his computer. I keep saying his or her computer directly to Google Drive, which of course is as common a use case as doing it from a web application. So I think that would be the solution to that. If you're interested in the different types of uploads, sorry to cut you off on that, Claudia. If you're interested in the different types of upload, there's the document Claudia said, or check our history of Google Developer Live sessions where Steve Basil talks in depth about this.
Should probably check it out. Want to go with the last question?
And the last question, that's the same. This is a good one, because we can talk about this. Don't send email notification when ACL modified for Google Doc. That's not really a question, but I'm guessing it's saying, how can I modify an ACL for a Google Doc without sending an email notification? I'm going to let Claudia answer, but just as a bit of background, in the Google Drive user interface, when you share something with someone, you have a little checkbox to say notify them by email, and you can set a custom message. The API is exactly the same. By default, it does send an email. Is that right?
Yeah.
So is there a way that we can not send the email?
Yes, there is a way. And so this user is trying to use the documents list API, the older API, which exposes this functionality. But the Java library, so these developers using Java, and unfortunately, Java library, I think it was using Java.
That's right, yeah.
Oh, yeah. And unfortunately, Java library, the Java client library, doesn't expose this option. So if you want to use the older documents list API with Java, there's no way to do this unless you hardcode it somewhere, or you have to hack it around. A better solution would be to use the new Drive API, which has native support for this. So there is property called send notification emails, or there is actually a method called a setter method called send notification emails, and you can set it to true or false whenever you insert request. So this is one of the advantages in using the new API, is that the client libraries are automatically updated. So whenever we have a new thing released in the API, a new feature, a new field, a new method, in a very short amount of time, all the libraries will be automatically regenerated, so that users will always have the latest version of it, unlike the old ones. So that is one of the reasons why we are moving all the APIs to this new structure.
And And I see in the comments it says, unfortunately, my application is heavily based on the documents list API. So exactly that case. So as Claudia said, we would have to hack around it. How would you hack around it? Well, most of the methods you can pass a URL in directly. Yeah. And for that, you will need to manually append the send notification emails equals false. You'd have to actually concatenate that on the end of the URL. So it's not ideal, but that's the way to do it. Again, we would strongly recommend using the Drive API if you can for this kind of use case.
Yeah, all these parameters are listed in the docs. So this is found in the documents list API documentation. So if you want to know what other parameters are there, you can just look at the docs. But take into account that not all client libraries support the same features. Exactly. So you can be in a case like this where your favorite language, the client library for your favorite language doesn't actually support the field or method that you want. Maybe because it's new, maybe because it's something experimental, or many other reasons. You should, when you can, you should move to the Drive API.
Agreed. And I think on that note, we should leave it. Thank you very much for joining us. We'll be back again this week and next with some more of your questions. If you have any burning questions, please by all means ask them, and we'll get around to answering them for you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.